Right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all for coming out on such a horrible day. Hasn't it been, what the Scots call it, dreich, don't they? Horrible. Anyway, a very warm welcome, and our museum director, Maria, at the back, has given you all 5 gold stars for turning out. It's a very warm welcome to Rear Admiral John Lippiett and his wife Penny, who's lurking at the back, for coming to visit us. I met John last year when he was speaking on a cruise, and I thought that would be jolly good for St Barb. So I waited until he was really relaxed at the end of the cruise, and we were out on some isolated island in the middle of the Atlantic, and I said, how about coming to speak at St Barb? Anyway, so thank you for coming. I've got a few things to tell you about before John starts his talk. As it happens, your children were at Walhampton, and I hope you have all got tickets to our reception next Thursday, the 20th, which is it's our annual reception for friends and patrons, and it's at Walhampton House and School, and we'll be having a guided tour of the house and the grounds, as well as the reception. Tickets are still available. They're online, or you can buy them at the front desk. Our current exhibition, Seen Through Wood engravings, has been very popular, and it goes on for another week. And then we're starting our annual open exhibition on the 29th of April, which is always very good, very popular, and the best of local art. We've also, following our funding successes recently, got some new staff in the museum that you might see around. We have a lovely lady in collections called Kira. We have Leo, who's lurking at the back there with a camera. He's our fundraising manager now. And Kirsty, who's lurking the other side, who's our events apprentice. So we're doing some apprenticeships. So they're all very welcome, and I hope when you meet them in the museum, they'll introduce themselves and you will enjoy meeting them. Our next talk is we're back to the first Friday, 5th of May, and the day before the coronation, indeed. We'll have Aldred Drummond talking about the Cadland estate, which many of you will know is over the Calshot Hythe end of the Solent. And they have a garden designed by Capability Brown that not a lot of people know about. So we've asked him to talk a bit about that, and also to bring us up to date with what's happening with the Cadland estate, because they own and are developing the power station over at Fawley. So I hope you will all be interested in that and ask him some difficult questions, no doubt. So with that, I will hand over to John, who's going to talk about life on board the Mary Rose. He was CEO of the Mary Rose Trust for 13 years after he left a very distinguished career in the Navy. So with that, John, over to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Prue. And actually, I said no when you asked me. You're a good persuader. Good evening, and lovely to be back in Lymington. As you heard, we had 3 children who adored this school across the way at Walhampton, and it was really a great success for them, and they've never found a school so good thereafter, and they're searching for their children now, and they still can't find one of that quality. But I'm not here for that reason. I'm here to talk about the Mary Rose. Is the quantity of voice coming across okay? You know a lot about the Mary Rose already. I know that. How many think that she sank on her maiden voyage? Wonderful. Usually I get half a dozen hands at least, because she came up after the Vasa, the Swedish flagship, which did sink on the maiden voyage. All the headlines in this country said she sank on her maiden voyage. When we were out there for the 25th anniversary, I had the vice president who'd been out there at the actual lifting, and he said, I thought she sank on her maiden voyage. He didn't know after all those years. So This fine ship, and I'll tell you more about it, and I'll take you through. I use a lot of slides. I never stay still, so I sort of look around and see who is concentrating very hard with their eyes shut, because it's much easier concentrating. It's much easier listening to what I say if you don't watch the pictures, so I quite understand that. So I'm going to a bit of history, be going back, because Henry VIII, he was born, Arthur, his elder son, was going to be the king, born 1491. A year later, Christopher Columbus does that amazing voyage across the Atlantic. And he had 3 ships, all tiny, but his flagship, the biggest of them all, was called a carrack. It's a brand new design of ship, far bigger, as you can see in that picture, than the others. And so this is the first of a new class of ship that came in. And his flagship there, it's worth me just saying, 70 feet long, 120 tons, 40 men. That's the biggest of that fleet of 3 that went across. Then a bit later, Vasco da Gama, this is all in Henry's lifetime, goes in his ship, and his flagship, 90 foot long, 100 tons, 60 men. They're getting bigger. And Henry is aware of these voyages because it rewrites history, and the history of the world, actually, because of the trade it's starting to bring to northern Europe as opposed to just the eastern end of the Mediterranean. So Henry is crowned just under the age of 18, 1509, and the first thing he does is says, I want some ships, I want some carracks. And so he sets about building 2 ships straight away. This map, if you can make it out, you'll recognize it. I put it in deliberately because the oaks for the Mary Rose came from the Southampton Basin and undoubtedly from the royal forests around here. And indeed, they will be taken in rafts or towed behind ships to the dockyard on Portsmouth to be built. And I found recently a document saying that, of course, they could use the tides, double tides, so and very strong tides, as you well know. So they got there quite efficiently using the tides. But I found that in one storm, in inclement weather, and we know about that in the last few days, one raft of major timbers came in here to Lymington to seek shelter in that time. So Lymington was part of the story of the Mary Rose. I'll come back to this map later because it's an important one. So he builds this ship. It's a carrack, it's the first of the nation, smooth-sided rather than clinker-built with overlapping planks. So it's a new design. This is a picture of her at the end of Henry's reign, and I'll take you back to it later. But the Mary Rose, 150 feet. Think how much bigger that is than those other ships. 500 tons, 500 men on board. So it is massive. The biggest ship, the most modern ship in the world, built there. He also built another one called a Peter Pomegranate. I was always very relieved to be collecting money for the Mary Rose Museum and not the Peter Pomegranate Museum. It was a wee bit easier. Mary for the Virgin Mary, Rose for the Tudor Rose, Peter for St. Peter, Pomegranate for the Aragonese coat of arms. He goes to war. He decides that he's going to be Henry V all over again. He's a fit, young, eager man serving the Pope in this. The Pope doesn't like France, so let's go to war with them and be Henry V all over again. I've taken this picture. It's actually a battle on the Mediterranean. It doesn't matter because it shows that warships in those days would actually go alongside each other and have, in effect, a land battle. So they had lots of soldiers up top, and then they fought each other because they tried to capture each other's ships. And there you see someone climbing on board. Well, in the First French War, the Mary Rose had on board Sir Edward Howard, the Lord High Admiral, commanding. And off they went, and he led a boarding party on board the French ships off Brest for the First French War. Well, he climbed up on board, no one followed him, and that was the end of Sir Edward Howard. They piked him to death and threw him overboard. So Henry actually appointed his older brother, who was a bit wiser and never went to sea, like the Duke of whatever it was, or whoever it was in Gilbert and Sullivan. In that battle, actually, another of the ships, the Regent, went alongside Cordilleria, oh, I can't pronounce it this time of night, and they both caught fire and exploded and sank. So he then tries a bit of peace. So this is a lovely, massive picture in Hampton Court. And it shows the Mary Rose. It's called the Embarkation of Dover for the First Field of the Cloth of Gold, 1520. And there, can you see, this is Mary Rose. It's got the royal coat of arms on the stern there, but do you see a white box there? I think the Queen's on board. I think this is the Queen's privy, the thunderbox. There are no others in the entire fleet which are shown in this picture. This is the only one. So I think that says the Queen's on board that one. Henry's, by that stage, built a yet bigger ship called the Great Harry. Henry Grace Adieu, its proper name. And he is in that one. He builds it because the King of Scotland builds the Michael, which is bigger than the Mary Rose, so he has built yet a bigger one. But it's an arms race in those days. So the Field of Cloth of Gold didn't work, so he goes to war again against France. And if you can make this out, this engraving out, the Mary Rose is the ship on the left of the screen there. It is the fleet there actually taking it. This is an amazing engraving. There's a series of engravings of various engagements that were under Henry's command. There's Henry there, but just doffing his hat there is Sir Anthony Browne. Sir Anthony Browne, the master of the King's Horse, he lived in Cowdray House, quite close to Chichester, and he took selfies everywhere he went with the King, because he had an oil painting painted of where he was with the King. And this is important to the story because you'll come on to one a bit later on. So we've got this record of the engravings. Cowdray House burnt down, but the Society of Antiquaries had taken engravings of all his pictures beforehand. So we have the engravings and can tell what went on. Of course, Henry was actually much loved by the Pope at this stage and made defender of the faith on the coinage and so on. So he was a good Roman Catholic and doing all the right things until he wanted divorce. And we all know the story of what went on there and the foundation of the Church of England and him being at the head of it. And then he knew he was in trouble because the rest of Europe would turn against him, which they did. This map is a map that he had in Hampton Court pinned up. It's actually got the pinholes in it. It's in the British Library. But it actually shows that Portsmouth is the major defence of the country. There it is there on his map. But Henry suddenly realised from this map onwards that maps were so important to strategic command and fortifications and so on. So from that, he had the whole of the south coast of England mapped in great detail. And it was all put together. They had sent different maps up to Greenwich where they were all put together to show what went on. I've gone back to this map. William Cecil's map is 1570, so after that. But I want to show you, because there I've ringed the fortresses defending the Solent and the approaches to Portsmouth. I understand your last talk was on Hurst Castle. There it is. But it shows all his forts, which he had built between his taking the supreme head of the church and actually the battles that came forward, knowing there will be a battle there. Henry is getting iller, and cankerous, really very angry. He knows war is coming, so he decides to take the initiative, and he takes his army, all his army, across to Boulogne, which he sieges. And there again, you see the fleet there landing all the troops. His army is across there, and there's Henry with Edward Browne behind him and taking charge. So his army in France, and is still in France, when in 1545, another engraving, same series of them, of the battle when the French fleet comes across to actually attack England, with Henry's France there. Now that's the Isle of Wight, Bembridge on fire there. The French fleet is twice the size of the Spanish Armada. There are between 30 and 40,000 French troops coming to capture England. Henry, and you'll see them in the foreground on Southsea Common there, has only got 10,000 local militia. We are near helpless. But the fleet is there. There's Henry. Southsea Castle is only commissioned and opened the year before this there, but Henry's there. And there's the Master of the King's Horse right behind him in his selfie there. But this picture tells us an awful lot about the battle that went on. The fleet is still coming out of the harbour there. Henry's only got about 64 ships against, I think it's 225 or so of the Frenchmen, so way outnumbered. But they're in a good strategic position, anchored there. Both fleets are becalmed at the start of the day, and the wind gets up. The French have rowed in galleys. Do you see galleys rowing in there? And the Mary Rose is the vice flagship at this stage, with Sir Edward Carew on board, Sir George Carew rather. He is told to sail out and attack. And he goes and he fires his guns. This is in fact the Henry Grasser job, because the Mary Rose has fired its gun and it has capsized and sunk. Amazing. Herald of Free Enterprise, sinking like a stone. The ship tipped over. Water poured in through the gun ports. This is a modern, obviously, picture by Jeff Hunt I commissioned to put into the new museum. Water pours through the open gun ports. When it fires a salvo, Mary Rose fires the first salvo in world history against the French. But they didn't say close the gun ports. Mistake. And a lot of top weight and all the soldiers in their armour up in the high castles, she was doomed, and a gust of wind blew her over, and that was it. A massive loss of life. Over 200 men on board, they reckon, some 30 survived. And they told the tale. So she's on the seabed, very shallow, it's only about 50 feet deep. You know the strong tidal streams, so they work away, putting silt inside, and then cover her up with mud entirely. And there she lies for a very long time. A chap called Alex McKee, a historian and an amateur diver, gathered together amateurs and searched from 1966 to 71, searching, probing the grounds and finding hard things, going down to find it. And eventually they found, and as they went down, so they found and identified the Mary Rose. And as they went down, it was like finding Pompeii. The riches in the positions where they were when the ship sank, unless they tipped to the one side of the ship. 500 divers, 25,000 hours underwater, 27,000 items recovered, which came together to produce 18,000 artifacts. And it's those that are the great treasures, as well as the ship itself. Who remembers it coming up on television? They reckon something like 65 million people watched it. It was the largest outside broadcast ever done. This was 40 years ago last October. So we were out at the rec site again celebrating it with Bruce Parker, who was the BBC reporter doing it. And it was fascinating because no one was expecting to go on that long. They're running out of things to say, so they were ringing up people and saying, can you talk about this? Can you talk about the insurance? Can you? And 11 hours, I think it was. A remarkable thing. And then it was towed in on the Babcock cradle, onto which it had been lifted underwater and put into the dry dock, lent by the Admiralty for 3 months. We're still in it. We've got a 100-year lease, with a tent, plastic tent put over the top, with a 10-year life, and that's how I inherited the ship. It was being sprayed inside first with chilled water and then brought upright and sprayed with polyethylene glycol, which is like a candle grease, which when heated is liquid and a very fine spray, but when it's cooled down, it's solidified and is rock hard. And I've brought a piece of wood, which you can look at. I won't pass it around, look at afterwards, just to show you a bit of the Mary Rose, and it's very solid. And I'm told, when we were arguing about the guarantee for the roof of the museum, and it's 40 years guarantee, to which one trustee, thinking he was very smart, he said, well, how long is the Mary Rose going to last? And the scientist said, well, we've done all the calculations, 40,000 years. So the conversation moved on. We were drying it out, and these great tubes were put through it, having built a new museum around it. Who has seen the new museum, please? A fair number. Next time I come, I'd like everyone's hands up, please. But in the meantime, so we opened it, but with drying underway, and then we opened it up entirely. That's the main gun deck, and the quality of the wood, which is absolutely extraordinary. So there's the museum we opened in 2013. I had joined in 2003, and so a lot of pain and strife to get there, but it worked. That's the hull that we've got. We raised the stem timber which is the bow timber there. And so that will be put back eventually. It's in the museum, but lying down flat on the ground at the moment. And that's the ship we have. And you can see it is the majority of it, but of the starboard side. So that is sitting on the cradle on which it was lifted in the dry dock, grade 1 listed, which didn't make it very helpful. And our museum is at 3 levels through the whole area with galleries either end. But we built the port side, the mirror image, to put all the objects into where they were, because they're too heavy to go into the hull itself. So that's how we've done it. So that's the museum cross-section at 3 levels is like that. But some people say, well, it's a very fat ship, wasn't it? It wasn't that fat. That is the size of the ship, just to make sure that you don't think it was an absolutely huge one. So there's the hull for those who haven't seen it, down at the lower level, and then from the top level as you go through. And you're actually in the chamber there with it at that top level. All of this is air-conditioned and relative humidity to plus or minus 2 degrees centigrade and 2 degrees relative humidity. That is a vast space. It has never been done anywhere in the world to that degree, and all the cabinets have that same one. You can imagine the cost of the expense of electricity and so on to run that, which is eye-watering. But there we go, it has to be done. Talking about the ship, another portrait by Jeff Hunt he did for the 500th anniversary of the building, which I got him to do, but it shows it's got these square sails forward and triangular sails aft, triangular sails helping it sail. It could sail really well. The Admiral would write to the King, "Sire, she is the greatest ship that e'er did sail in Christendom." She sailed beautifully until they cut lots of holes in the ship's side, put lots of soldiers and armour on top, and sailed around with the gun ports open. 200 mariners. This is one of just the corner down at Land's End, but one of the maps of Henry, but there's the Mary Rose in it. I've arrowed there a sailor. No health and safety, no rack lines and so on, climbing up there and managing those huge sails. I dare say there are quite a lot of sailors amongst you here this evening. That's awe-inspiring. That picture really frightens me, the size of the sail. As a fighting ship, there she is. This, in fact, is the inventory of Henry's navy at the end of his reign, knowing that he was dying. And they still have Mary Rose there because they thought they could still raise her. But in it, it tells an awful lot. It gives us the number of people on board and so on, but 180 soldiers, and they're the ones who are up in the castles there. But the gunpowder, shots of iron, shots of stone and lead, it tells us everything. Now, when it's got the various guns, historians didn't know what a falcon was and so on. They did not know. But having got the Mary Rose, they can put that together with the inventory to say actually what those guns are. So that was quite revealing to people. And of course, we got the hand weapons of the soldiers, those 180 plus soldiers. Some say there were up to 700 men on board at the time, some accounts. But you've got the pikes, the bills, the gun shields. Everyone wore a dagger like this, and they wore it in a prominent place because it was the king's ship. They had netting over the upper deck because it's still thought that the enemy would try and climb on board to capture their ship. So we've got the netting, and we've got the actual knots and so on, so we can see. And there you'll see it in the museum, is the netting that was covering them in, which is why many, not that they could swim, never escaped. And you'll see it that way. The longbow. This is probably the last battle in which they even thought about using the longbow because the gun had come in and the broadside had been fired. So these longbows were wonderful things. Incidentally, there were no longbows. There's one drilled through in a castle somewhere. No medieval longbows like that. So the collection of them has proved, because 3 were tested to breaking point, that they can pull twice the weight that archers and historians thought. 180 pounds pull, and it's 6 arrows a minute. That is an amazing feat. And we've got the arrows, thousands of them, made of poplar. But the guns important because it's become a gunnery ship. And there, back to that close-up look, do you see there's a bronze one and an iron one, the black one there. So this tells us quite a lot of detail. So if we turn to that, the wrought iron gun there, and there's a diagram of it. because it's long bars of iron bound with hoops, which is why we call the barrel of a gun made like a barrel, and then there are the rings there, and then they'd fill that canister with gunpowder, ram it in and fire it. And we've got these guns. Now, they're not so rare because they were old siege weapons and they were ashore and so on the old sort of carts. But when the bronze guns coming, this is a new invention, bronze guns coming in, Henry brought the Flemish and the French bronze founders across to actually make the guns and teach us how to do it. Every gun is an independent cast, and when they break the cast, they build another gun. It's not the same size. That gun carriage is a new form of carriage. A gunner from the Mary Rose could have fought at Trafalgar. It's exactly the same weapon, same manner of firing it and so on as at Trafalgar 250 years later. The bronze ones are marvellous sculptures. The quality of sculpture is amazing. And they're all about his grandeur. They're all about showing off because Henry wants to see everyone see how powerful they are. And with inscriptions saying, Lord of France, King of France, Lord of Ireland, King of England, he is so proud of it. This one I was determined to have out in the open so people get closer to it. It is magnificent. It is an absolute sculpture. It's on a perspex carriage because I didn't want it in an air-conditioned compartment so people get closer. And in the museum, everything behind glass on exhibition is from the Mary Rose unless it's perspex, because we don't want to put labels on everything. But this one actually has an inscription on it saying it's made by the English as opposed to the French and the Flemish. I'm just showing you the size there. This is 5 tons, this gun. That is an amazing weight. Imagine getting these on board the ship, cutting the holes in the ship's side with the ship built. We had to create whatever I want to say, I'm losing the word, but machines to pump them up and down to get them in, and a lot of health and safety. These were got into the ship with men and ropes. And there's the gun deck looking down and firing that broadside. An extraordinary sight. Of course, every cannonball had to be a different size. So there we've got stone hand-chipped cannonballs, Kentish ragstone, but then they were starting to mould shot for the different ones. But as every different gun was a different size, the gunner for each gun had to have a measure to test it before they fire it. Otherwise, you have a disaster on your hands. Now, I want to go into the ship to actually give us something about the men. Here's the carpenter, his cabin. He is the engineer officer on board. He is in charge of the stability, the ship's hull and its watertight integrity and so on. Just in a modern ship today, he had 7 apprentices living in this cabin, quite a big cabin, with his dog there. So the archaeologists drew where they found everything. Every single item, all those 28,000 things, had an individual card saying who found it, where it was found, exact coordinates and so on, what condition it was and so on. But they were able to say this is exactly how the cabin was. And then in this mirror image, we've been able to put things back into his cabin that were there. And you see their augers, there's an adze there, and because the iron has usually rusted away, so we just put the iron in perspex so you can see what they are. People walk through the main gun deck. They say, how do you get this ship moving? But we've actually bent the deck to the shape of the ship, so they think, and it's got the noise of the creaking timbers and the barking dog and so on. Very atmospheric. But you can look up, which they couldn't have done on board, onto the upper deck to see that's anchor cable up there. And anchors up there, and then they had smaller cannons up there. So, and it's an amazing feeling on board, and you get the idea of how cramped the men would have been. 500 plus men in that ship, all living together. No bunks or anything like that. The carpenter has a chest. In the chest, we can see what he has. His pewter plates, his knives, his beautiful tankard there. This pocket watch. All the officers in their chests had a pocket watch. I bought a replica There's one in the British Museum, but I brought this one. We've got a number of these. I'll put that there. If you're looking at it afterwards, please don't bend. The little gnomon flaps out there, but it's about the size of a 50p. It tells the time if the sun's out, which is great. It tells the wrong time because it's been made in Nuremberg. But that doesn't matter. It's a status symbol. You know, it's only rough anyway, so we won't get too fast. His backgammon board. Who knew they were playing backgammon in those days? But actually, it's an ancient game anyway. But not only that in that condition, but the dice. Now, these dice were in the cup, in the drawer, in the chest, in the cabin, in the ship. This is layer upon layer upon layer of about 3 o'clock in the afternoon of the 19th July, 1545. It's Pompeii, but in Pompeii, people fled for about 2 days with all their valuables to different places. This is where it was when they went to action. So that is an extraordinary time capsule, almost to the hour, certainly to the day of where it was. There's the ship's dog. It's lovely. I get O from audiences over dogs. When I show you the human beings, I don't get any O's at all. This is so British, it's lovely. I took the dog, when we closed the museum and I need more publicity, well, we did a DNA test and we know it has brown eyes and brown hair and is probably the sort of Jack Russell, that sort of size mongrel, and know that. I took it to Crufts and it won the top skeleton of the show award. So I was pleased with that. But we do have the carpenter. And we had a number of the skulls forensically interpreted by the person who does it for the CID and did it for the Vasa Museum. So, OK, we have to go by the hairstyles that we see in pictures of the day, but that is his face. His wife would recognize him from this. We've got his shoes, his shoelaces, his all sorts of things. I think this is one of the most fascinating collections. In his chest, he's got this cutthroat razor, thimble. All the officers had thimbles, so they must have been sewing up their own clothes, even at the sea. A shaving brush, a whetstone, a manicure set, though. This manicure set is carved in bone. Now, the engineer officers, Lee, I'm right, aren't I, didn't really go around preening themselves too much, not in our days. Someone who was in the Navy with me there. But to see that the carpenter is cleaning his nails with this is extraordinary. Only one we found on board. But we've got his tools, absolutely recognisable like that. If we turn now to the surgeon, when the two livery companies, the barbers and surgeons, were combined by Henry VIII, I think 1540, Holbein drew the picture of everyone, and this is in Barber's Hall. And we believe ours, who is a very senior one, is in the foreground in that picture. We've got his coif, which is his, the hat. We've laid it flat for conservation reasons. Black velvet silk, those termed brown. We've got the shaving bowl. His apprentices would have done the shaving. Apprentices serving 7 years at that. We've got all sorts of nasty things like that. We've got pots of the ointments. So we've been able to analyse the ointments and work out what they used. And so each pot has been worked out and is labelled. The bleeding bowl there for taking blood, because if people weren't feeling very well, he took a pint of blood and got them going again. The syringe, we tell school children it's for cleaning wounds. It's actually the urethral syringe for the French pox. The French called it the English pox, and just occasionally when we're at peace together, it was called mal de Napoli. They injected, I'm told, mercury, but to make it less painful, they warmed it up first. We've got the fleas, the nits, and so on, in the knit combs, and I have to say, nothing has changed. I mean, you'll see Greek and Roman knit combs like this. The fine work. Everyone had their own, so there's no sharing of knit combs around. But kids do love seeing it and do love knowing they're not the only ones to be using these things. And that's actually a Tudor knit in the magnifying thing there. So wonderful works of art. When people, craftsmen are trying to make these today, made of boxwood, really strong wood, they can't make the teeth so fine as they did. The barber surgeon's tools, I always said that was the anaesthetic, the mallet. But in further research, it's for that chisel, so amputation of small bits of bone, like fingers and so on, you just one whack of the chisel on the chisel, and that was it. Whereas the flesh knife and the bone saw, they did amputations. We've got the quartering irons and all sorts of things like that, because they knew they'd die if they, had a very bad leg, so might as well take it off and see, and some did live. So an extraordinary number of those things. We've got them, and for a long time it was a policy not to display the human remains, but we thought we should tell their story. This is their mausoleum. This is it. The tooth abscess there, the officers had lousy teeth, rotted away because they could afford honey and sugar and so on. The men have brilliant teeth because they couldn't afford it. There's a lesson for us all, I think. You've got broken bones, badly set, so you can see the damage there. Rickets and scurvy showing them. And I just say this, that the average height is 5'7" of the men we have on board. We've got about 87 complete skeletons. This archer is over 6 foot tall. But the wear and tear on an 18-year-old boy has the sort of repetitive strain injuries of a 60-year-old today. So that puts into how hard it was at life. But this archer, really strong, and we put forensically a reconstruction of him there, and he is really strong, really strong arms, but his shoulder blades are malformed, he's got compressed spine, and he has a problem, that archer. We've done DNA analysis on a whole number of them now, and there's a lot of research. We have one from North Africa, perhaps Moroccan, one from Italy, one from Southern Europe. So they were not just British. A lot of research going on, so much more research to be done, but it shows what a diverse ship's company there was. The only name other than the captain on board, the Admiral, was the cook, because he scratched on his bowl and his tankard, Nye Coop, cook. So we know his name. There's his bowl with his name, but those are the things he had on him at the time, in his clothing. There's his galley, one of 2 galleys. It's like a pizza oven. It's got, we've got all the timber, the firewood for it, and his chopping blocks, but a great big cauldron, so they could boil, they could bake, they could fry, they could do all sorts of things like that. Amazing. Hundreds of these bowls. These bowls, tan-turned, wonderful beechwood bowls, beautifully done, but you see there are quite a lot of engravings on them. And these engravings are the personal marks of the people because, having got it, they want to say, this is mine, and they were proud of it. It was their marks. So in acknowledging that this museum is their mausoleum, we put all their marks around the outside of the wooden cladding of the museum. And indeed, the museum has been blessed by the bishops, Roman Catholic and Church of England, before the opening. In their name, this is their exhibition, and we feel that very much. So lots of plates and bowls and cooking instruments and so on. A gallon of beer per sailor per day. Weak beer, but nonetheless, water is no good at all. They had flesh 4 times a week, fish 3 times a week. We've got evidence of all sorts of things like that. So we've got a whole lot of the food from in the barrels, obviously rotted away. That cod recently has had the DNA tested, and it's from Newfoundland. So the Newfoundland fisheries are actually coming across to feed the English fleet at that time. Amazing. Wax and tallow candles. The lanterns, they're beautiful things. The horn of the lantern, the panes, rots away in water, of course. There's, I have to say, the Admiral, the only pot, known as a piss pot in those days, was the Admiral's. I'm always suspicious about what he drank in those days. It's much better these days. Navigation, I just want to touch on. So this is a contemporary picture of the time of the captain on deck with a compass and various things. A leaden line is to test the depth. Well, the Greeks had this, nothing in that, but we've got lots of those. but gimbaled compasses, compasses to stay upright, and sailors will know this, they said that didn't come in for another 100 years. We've got 3 of those, gimbaled, to keeping it upright. This is the log reel. Again, historians said that was at least 100 years to measure the speed, and in a more modern way, and it went on through Victorian times and so on, you have a rope wound up, you had that chip, that triangular thing, throw it overboard, time it for about 30 seconds with an hourglass, a little sand glass, bring it in and count the number of knots in it, and the number of knots told you the speed, which is why we still talk about speed being in knots. So there are the various glasses of different sizes to keep the time. Ship's bell. Every half hour, the ship's bell was rung the number of rings. So changing the watch, 8 bells, and then 1 bell for half past, and then 2 bells, and so on through the watch. I had the privilege of being allowed to ring this and record it. So when you walk around the museum, you will hear the time rung on the ship's bell at that time actually done. You'll see the ship's bell in there, which is a magnificent thing. And for the anniversary of the lifting, 25th anniversary, and for the opening of the museum, I took the bell out to the wreck site and rang that bell, 8 bells, at that time. It was very emotional because that would have been the last sound they heard as they died. So the officers, we know quite a lot about the officers because they all had their chests, and in the chest we found all sorts of things like these, precious things. Pepper, worth its weight in gold. The trade is just starting to come in from the Indies because of Vasco da Gama and so on. Really valuable. But this is a pepper mill in an officer's chest. We've got quite a lot of pepper from it. We've got the pouches. If we open the pouches, we've got the contents of each of the officers. What was he carrying on the day? Well, huge assortments like that. This is one of the favourites. So it's about just 3 inches high or so, carved in ivory. And there it is. It's from, if you go to the Ashmolean, you'll see in a single cabinet a wonderful casket made in about 1540 in North Italy. You could take out one of the little panels and put this one in. This was, it turns out now, having done the DNA, an Italian officer. He had small feet too, so we've got very small shoes for him. We always thought it might be Italian. A most wonderful carving there, really beautiful, but from Italy, about 1540. This is 1545. We've got the Admiral's band on board. This is, we've got 2 fiddles, the earliest violin, apparently, in the world. And I came across some scientists who were there from Poland, and they said, what are you doing? Well, we're looking at your violin. I said, is it the oldest? They said, well, we've got one we think is older, but it's been changed over the years. This is 1545, guaranteed. So they are saying this is the earliest. The still shawm, it's the predecessor of the clarinet or the oboe. But as such, it's got a reed in it. We've made replicas, we can play them. It sounds awful, which is why it didn't go on very long. It sort of almost ran out of puff, but they made the oboe and clarinet instead. The pipes and the drums. So a drummer would play the pipe in one hand and drum with the other, and there are a lot of illustrations of that. So we've got those there. We've got the Admiral's pewter. But pewter exists ashore, it's the wood that doesn't. So the wood is far more important than the pewter. But these are George Carew's stamped GC. Gold coins, lots of silver coins, which are badly corroded. I was holding my hand a gold coin 20 minutes after it came to the surface, 1544, when we did some excavations when I first got there. They were going to build a deep water channel for the new aircraft carrier right through the Mary Rose wreck site. I blew the whistle, having just left the Navy, saying stop. So they funded for 3 years excavations to prove my theory that it was still there. And there is more there, still there. The bosun's call. Now, senior officers had that. The Admiral was given a golden call by the King the night before when the King was on board the Mary Rose. There's one on the Silk Ribbon. I bought a replica of that. So you can see that. They're still used today, and they're used in most navies of the world. And that's the original silk, obviously. The rosaries. Okay, they've broken away from Rome, Church of Rome, but they're still rosaries. So when I took the Roman Catholic bishop and the Anglican bishop around the museum before it opened, the Roman Catholics said, there we are, that proves that they're still Roman Catholic. So there's a great argument between the two bishops, because Edward didn't ban it till, I think, 1554, if I'm right, the rosaries. So they had their rosaries. But we've got their clothing. Leather has survived, but so that woolen jerkin there, rose madder dye. We've got the shoes, the shoes, but also on the left there was knitted stockings and patterned material, where people were saying, oh, they weren't putting patterns in material in those days. So we've got the ship, the hull, doing that. It's static. So we are projecting from every now and then men into it. And one of my last talks I gave while Chief Executive at the Mary Rose was to the Royal College of Surgeons for their annual dinner down in Bath. And in Bath, I gave them a Mary Rose talk about the medicine of the Mary Rose. But before, have you been to the Roman baths, anyone? You wander down below, typical one, but they really rather boring. But they projected Romans being towed down and scraping themselves and so on. And it was very effective on the walls. 3 months later, I had the Romans in Roman togas being projected into the ship, and it worked. So we've done that for ours, and we've got the men of the Mary Rose put into it very, I think, effectively. And it really brings it to life, both in peacetime and wartime, with all the noise. So if you're passing the surgeon's cabin and look across, you'll see him extracting and hearing the noise, teeth, from the sailor across the way, really penetrating sound. So these things go on, and it really brings the whole story together, and it's the story about the men of the Mary Rose. And just occasionally, up on the quarterdeck, someone will stand up and either pipe and say, call the hands, or he will ring the bell and say, all hands on deck. And they got me to do that. They brought me out of retirement to do it, because all the people in there, either the staff or the volunteers of the Mary Rose acting, or their children, acting as the crew. So we'd like to say when their story ended, their world ended, we continue it today. It continues. There is much, much more to find out about the Mary Rose tomorrow than even today. Science is just opening everything up. She is a treasure trove for future research, but she is a treasure trove of Tudor England and is remarkable. It's said by many to be the world's finest insight into Tudor life. If you haven't seen it, please do. If you haven't seen it for a while, do again, because there are new galleries going in. Now you have the ability. You're standing on the gun deck when the ship is sailing, and you see the guns firing, the French fleet coming past, and then suddenly the water pours in, and the ship's tipping over, water's coming in, people are holding onto the side. The ship, nothing's moving. It is very realistic. What they opened about 3 weeks ago is at the other end, in the final gallery, they put a small 40-seater 4D cinema where you go in, they do it very well. For a 10-minute film, it's very well explained to understand the excavation and the raising of it. And you go underwater and you feel it. And do you remember that jolt? When the chain broke? Amazing, brilliant PR. The world stopped turning for that period because everyone, 65 million people, went, like that. However, they do it and your seat falls down in the cinema, so it has that effect. So do please go and see it. It is worth it. We, just like St Barb, depend on great support of people, be it patrons, but also visitors there. Your ticket lasts the year because you'll want to go back and back and back again because there's so much to see. So that completes my story. I hope, Prue, I've done right on your timing.
I'm sure that you will all agree that was not only entertaining but informative, and we all want to go and see it now, don't we? Has anybody got any questions? Lee, I've got a friend at the back there who's going to give you a microphone.
Technology.
Try this.
Sorry.
Thanks very much. Do you have naval architects looking at it and working out stability? Because whenever we all look at those ships, they're just so bloody top-heavy.
Thank you. Lovely, lovely prompt. Of course, I mean, the shipwrights at the time just did it by eye. They'd never built a carrack before, and they built it. In fact, if I can show you, because I knew I'm coming to a yachting fraternity too, probably. Let me just, Colin Moody, right at the start, and he published a book, and there's a chapter about it, about the Mary Rose, and I've just pinched a couple of his slides. That one of the cross-section and looking down on it, he declared that you could not build a finer hull than the Mary Rose. If you read that chapter, it is full of praise. Now, the top works, I wonder if it's my next slide. Yes. First of all, the castles aren't as big as they appear. This is Jeff Hunt working out for his picture. I've arrowed there the forecastle. It's almost the size of a scaffolding tower. It's really narrow, lots of windage. So for the sailors, I mean, a nightmare, because of the wind. But nonetheless, and they built it, well, it's an oak hull. The upper works are poplar, some of it, much lighter wood. Either they were running out of your wood in the New Forest and so on, or they realised it should be lighter. And the after castle is a bit wider, but there's not as big as it would appear in those pictures. But the fact is, she sailed very, very well. As I say, and there were reports of, she was going around, but those guns, and by cutting gun ports and putting those guns on, 5 tons apiece, she was going down in the water. Drake, in the Next Generation, said that it was only 14 inches of freeboard to the gun port. 14 inches. And he put the order out to his fleet that ships were not to manoeuvre an auto course without closing the gun ports. So he recognised that. So it hasn't got to tip over too much to do that. But you see the size of the sails against that. See the men up the mast there, having climbed to the top there, when you see the size of that. It's awe-inspiring. But, it was experimental warfare. And they got it wrong. And the people suffered. But a gust of wind, top weight, gun ports open, undoubtedly is what it was about. But the other thing was the realization that no longer would they have to go alongside each other and fight. So the Armada, coming 43 years later, 2 things. They never got close. The Spanish expected to have the boarding parties. They had a lot of soldiers on board, but they didn't do that. Yet the English used long-term gunnery to harass them, and also never allowed them near there was a battle off the Isle of Wight, but they were never allowed close into the Solent in either way, and they went further through. So the loss of the Mary Rose taught us a great deal, and probably why we won the Armada. Thank you for the question.
You mentioned the Herald of Free Enterprise at the beginning of your talk. I happened to look it up before coming here because I knew about it. It had left its port with its bow doors open, yes, and the water came up. It's rather like the water going of the gun ports, and it sank in 90 seconds, yeah, and 193 people were killed,
yeah,
which is, and I think you said 170 people were died on this. It's a similar amount, yeah, but it was about 440 years later, and the similar lesson in principle had repeated itself.
I agree. And it's horrifying. Yeah, I mean, in so many things we never learn from history. And yes, it's slightly different, but yes, interesting. I didn't know the numbers of people who died. 90 seconds, but I should think this was probably over in 90 seconds. Yeah, fascinating. And they could hear the cries from the castle. You'll see in that picture them pointing and seeing it. And on that, just to say, Lady Carew, the Admiral's wife, was alongside Henry. And he said he consoled her, saying, "Oh, my gallant men are drowned like ratons, like rats," which they were, because they were trapped. And talking about rats, actually, rats desert a sinking ship. We've got 3 tiny little rat bones. And that's all, because rats could get out and through the netting and then swim to the shore, certainly try and swim to the shore. Very few people could swim in those days. Even in the Victorian Navy, they didn't teach sailors to swim because they didn't think they'd be more likely to drown and prolong their agony as they were drowning. So it took some time to do that. Obviously some could, but and clinging onto the wreckage, as that picture shows. There's a...
And has the diving finished now? Are there any more relics, as it were?
Yes, there are. There are relics. As I say, I got there and I had 3 years of diving paid by the MOD to prove to me there were things when they were trying to prove there weren't things there, which is we brought out quite a lot. We then buried about 500 tons of sand and covers over it. There wasn't any diving. Funding it is expensive to do. But last year they did go down to check the condition of the wreck site. It is still a protected wreck. Therefore, but trawling fishermen go through and can damage things and so on. We try and keep them away. And so there's diving last year to look at it. They will go back. And one day, when someone leaves in their will whatever's required to do it, there's more of the forecastle. We found considerable amount of the forecastle. I wanted the stem to give the entire length of the ship. The world's press got absolutely hooked on. There was more Mary Rose coming up, and so there was big excitement around the world. And I knew that the stem timber, which is what we wanted, is really boring. Flat, wet, and just lying on a stem. And they were out there, so they'd found an anchor ring and the start of a stock in the mud, upright. They didn't know if there was anything on it or not. So I said, bring up the anchor. And the anchor came out first. And wow, it got all the photographs. So it was South China's Morning Post or whatever. There was the anchor. It was around the world, the anchor of the Mary Rose. We already had 5 anchors. We didn't really need it. But at least we got the PR and people talking about it. A photograph of the stem timber is meaningless other than to people who are really interested in the shape of a ship. Yeah. So I'm sure we'll go back one day, and it's exciting to do.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. Are there any contemporary accounts from survivors?
What is interesting is there's no official report of it. No one's had to write to the king, "Sire, I have just lost your favourite ship," because he saw it. So there was nothing. However, I won't go back to it, but in the picture of that engraving with the 10,000 men in South Sea Common, in front of them is someone, and he is Ambassador van der Delft, who is the Holy Roman Emperor's ambassador, and Charles V, and he has been on board the ship with Henry at dinner in the Mary Rose the day before. He is inspecting the troops in that picture. Afterwards, he had permission and he talked to some of the survivors, and he wrote an account. The only account is from Van der Delft back to Charles V, and in it he says, they say there was a gust of wind and the gun ports were open, the water poured in as she tipped over. So that to me is as good an eyewitness account as you can have of an ambassador examining, interpreting what the person is telling him who has survived it. And I think that is magnificent. The French say they sank it. You know, they say they're cannonballs on board. And in fact, there are those in this country who say, well, they must have made holes in it and therefore it was going down lower in the water. I don't think there's any need, but as you see, if it's only 14 inches away, then actually it would have gone down. So I do think Van der Delft is correct.
Thank you.
I can answer questions. Happy to go on afterwards, releasing people so they can go home, but thank you.
So John is very happy to take your questions, and you can examine the artefacts he's brought with him. But thank you all for coming along, and a special thank you, John, for finally giving in and coming to talk to us. It was most interesting.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And you're the first audience who haven't held up hands saying you think it sank on the maiden voyage, so you're very well educated.